All right. So welcome to part 2. So we're going to build up, we're going to stand up a ruler, and we're going to run one of these recommendations. So what we'll first look at is that QuickStart. So there's a page of the implementation guide that's a QuickStart. That's what we'll actually be walking through. So I will open that in my browser locally. That's kind of our game plan for the session. And we'll take some detours and look at some specific things, but I wanted to put that up as for those of you that want to follow along. You can go straight there and start digging in. So a couple caveats. If I could find my mouse, there it is. If you build the CQF ruler locally, if you're feeling particularly brave, if you build it locally, use that branch, Connectathon 21 enable annotations. So that has some fixes. Make sure that this actually works. And if you're using a Docker container, if you just want to stand up a Docker, that's the Docker you can use to run the content. And then just some specifications. These are the specs we'll be looking at. The FHIR Clinical Reasoning Module. Oh, back up. I will back up. Got it. All right. FHIR Clinical Reasoning Module, CDS hooks, the clinical quality language, the opioid CDS implementation guide that uses all of these things, and then the CQF recommendations. So those are just some links that you can use to dig further. And then if you were in the session yesterday, we actually have an Atom plugin that lets you validate CQL. So if you want to try playing and writing some of the CQL, you can use that. It's very helpful to have immediate feedback on whether your CQL is correct. All right, so then decision support in FHIR. So let's go back to this slide where what we're focusing on in the opioid implementation guide is these two blocks, basically. We are, one, describing the profiles that are needed to say this is what I expect the data to look like in order to get a valid evaluation of my decision support. And two, this is the, you're not seeing my mouse. Got it. That makes sense then. Let me walk over here. We're talking about these two. We want the profiles, the terminologies, what does the data look like for what I in order to get a valid evaluation, and we're talking about this one: library, CQL, activity definition, and plan definition. So those are the areas that we're focusing on. What we're trying to do is provide a shareable description of the behavior of a service that provides this guideline implementation. So these two. There's a whole set of things that you could do with questionnaires that would be tied in, but that's at a tier above what we're looking at. We're focusing on the logic tier and making sure that we have the data that we need in order to do that. So if you look at the implementation guide, it actually has a set of profiles, and those define the data elements that we're looking for, and then it has a set of libraries and plan definitions and activity definitions. So then going back to the approach, this is what we're actually gonna take on and look at. This whole box on the right side is all modeled as a reference implementation of a CQF ruler, which is a happy FHIR server that has a plugin that allows it to run CQL and exposes a CDS hooks endpoint so that you can call out to do that. Okay, so that's what we'll be running today. So back to this QuickStart. Let me pull that up. All right. So the first thing to do is to actually stand up a CQF ruler, right? So I don't know if any of you have been able to do that before, but let's open that in IntelliJ and just take a look at it. So really, there's basically a set of providers and configuration. The providers are overrides of things like discovery and prefetch for CDS hooks. There's evaluation for measure evaluation. You've got a bunch of configuration to plug it all into the FHIR infrastructure. And then a bunch of base providers that actually give you CQL execution, right? So if you're interested, you can dig into all of that code, but basically you go over to the runner and you just run it. And this is starting up a FHIR server and plugging in all of the pieces that we need. It's actually building and getting all the latest dependencies. So then back on the QuickStart, what we're trying to get to is a service that is standing up and has nothing in it, right?
If you got something that's slightly slower, what did you check out in the clips or in the IntelliJ?
Oh yeah, let me do that. Okay.
QuickStart page. It's not clear to me yet, but I should check out.
Um,
That's on the slide earlier.
yes. So if you go back to that's the GitHub of what you're checking out. So it's in the DBCG repository, which is our company's organization repository. There's a CQF ruler repository, and there's a branch there for Connectathon 21 enable annotations. You can see we do, by the number of Connectathon branches, we do support for a lot of different Connectathons and putting different pieces of functionality into this for different Connectathons. But that's the one that you want. So if you clone that locally, then open it up in IntelliJ, then this is what you get. You can also just run, if you've got Maven installed, you can also just run it from a Maven command line. You don't have to go into IntelliJ. I just go in to show how the code looks and all of that. But if you want to just run it from the command line, just Maven Jetty run. There's deployment instructions too on that CQF ruler GitHub site. Okay, so now it's actually running, and we will then use a postman to hit it. So let me pull this over. All right, so that's the base DSTU3. That's the base URL for that server that's running locally. And then if we do CDS services, those are the actual services. Oh, good hell. That's not what it's supposed to return. I don't know why it's returning that. Let me see if I can see what's happening there. Back on the QuickStart, luckily I took a screenshot. God damn it. Yeah, back on that. Back on that quick start. It's supposed to just give you an empty set if you have an empty ruler. So let me delete what's in the ruler and run that. So I'll stop that.
Makes you feel better and built in it returns.
It works for you? Hooray!
Yeah, I got an empty service as well.
Okay, so it's working for everybody except me. Awesome.
You get all sorts of errors in Eclipse, but it works just building the
Okay, just build it in Maven, and then so let me just try that instead of running it out of IntelliJ. All right, so that's it running. Standing up.
thought about breaking out the CQL evaluation just as a separate component.
Yeah, it actually is a separate component. The ruler, that CQL evaluation provider is just a glue code that pulls in the engine functionality, plugs it into the ruler. The engine itself is a separate component. And there's actually a CTLRunner. This is an execution service that just runs CQL. You can configure it to point to any FHIR server, and it'll run the problem with this one is that it can't resolve libraries. So it doesn't have a library resolver. So as long as all your CQL is in one library, it can run it. But That's what we plugged it into the ruler for, so we have a library resolver. So, okay. So that's now running. So let me see if, like this was working last night. I was like, okay, I can go to bed. Okay. Oh, that's why I'm posting, not getting. Sorry, it usually is just my fault. So when you get on the services, so what that's doing is actually pulling through, because I have libraries loaded in this server. So that's actually pulling back for each plan definition that you have loaded. It creates an endpoint and describes the content there. So the next thing to do in that QuickStart is to actually okay. There are two content. So if you've got it up and running and it's empty, then when you hit that CDS services, you'll get just an empty array, right? So what you've got to do is actually load up the content. Because again, we're distributing, and the goal is to actually have this runnable the way it's distributed. So those are all the individual resources. You can look at those, like here is OMTK data. This is the library that just has all of the drug information in it, right? So I've got drug ingredients table, and it literally just lists all of the drugs and their ingredients, and that's all that's in that library. Then you got OMTK logic. This one actually has the calculation for the conversion factors and the actual calculation logic for getting the MME. That one gets the ingredients and then the actual MME calculation right there. Then you've got a common library that all the recommendations use. This one just has like common inclusion and exclusion criteria that are checked by each recommendation. So for chronic pain, ambulatory opioid, ambulatory benzodiazepine, all of those kind of inclusion and exclusion that are checked at each recommendation. And then there's a library of CQL for each specific recommendation. So in this case, the patient view, we're actually looking at recommendation 10. Patient chart is opened. Patient is on opioids with abuse potential, and so the inclusion criteria is that main thing that's going to be checked. So they're 18 or older, they're on opioids with abuse potential, they have 80 of 90 days covered of those opioid prescriptions over the last 90 days. And they have no urine screening in the last 12 months, or evidence of opioids or evidence of illicit drugs in a screening. That's the basic inclusion criteria. So if you look then at the patient view plan definition, let's actually dig into that XML. The trigger is here. So when a patient view occurs, the condition is here. It's actually going to run the inclusion criteria out of this library. Okay, so what you have to do then is get all that content loaded. So what we did was create some content bundles. There's a terminology bundle. This has all of the value sets that are referenced by all of that CQL. And so if you just go there and you copy that and you paste it into Postman and you post it to the root, it'll post all of that content into your ruler, right? And then the same thing with the content bundle. This one is fairly large, but you copy this, paste it in a Postman, post it to the root, and you'll get all of those loaded. And then when you run CDS services, you should get this content, right? Which when I run that is what I get because I have it loaded. Okay, so any questions on that so far?
Just an in-memory database that our servers using.
I think it's configured to use, it's either Postgres or Derby. It's one of the two. We switch back and forth, but it's an actual database. But I think it's Derby right now because it's just files on disk, but it has an engine. And what it actually does is use the Happy uses JPA as its persistence layer, and the way we plugged the engine in was straight to that JPA layer. So this JPA data provider implements our engine's data access layer interface by reaching into Happy's JPA layer. So then it still works whether you've configured Happy to use Postgres or Derby or whatever. Okay. So then the next step on that QuickStart is to say, now that you've got this loaded, right? Everybody has all this loaded and it's working. All right. Once you have that loaded, then what you're seeing in this response here is that this is the discovery request in CDS hooks. How many are familiar with CDS hooks? I'm just kind of assuming everybody knows what CDS hooks is. So in CDS hooks, you've got the discovery endpoint, right? So this is a service that when you hit the discovery endpoint, it's going to tell you what services it has available. So this response is saying, is that a laser? Yes. Can you guys see that? All right. Because I can barely see it. Maybe I'm just old. This is saying on the patient view hook, there's a plan definition recommendation 10 service. That's a description of the actual service. And the ID, this ID right here, is the endpoint that you actually call to get that behavior. So you take the, sorry, let me go up a little bit on that. This base, and you put that ID on it, and then that's a request to that CDS hook server, okay? Then this prefetch piece is saying, in addition to the context that you'll normally send me for the patient view hook, which isn't much according to the CDS hook spec, but in the prefetch you can say I want additional information. You can build a prefetch template, which is basically just a templatized FHIR query, right? And so I'm realizing those templates aren't quite right there. But what this is saying is when you send me this request via CDS services, or via CDS hooks, tell me the patient and the medication request where medications are in this code list, and I've snipped that for brevity. When you get the actual services back, it's all of the codes. So the reason I'm doing that in the prefetch is that we can't rely on the fact that the target system has these value sets loaded. And so what I have to say is expand this value set and inline all the codes that it contains into the URL that we're using to request. If we could assume that the target system would understand what we meant when we said, give us codes in this value set, right? Then this prefetch template could just say that the code is in the URL for some value set, right? So that's the ideal scenario where we want to be. But because of the state of terminology distribution, we don't have that luxury right now. So this is a workaround. This is obviously not ideal to inline, a bunch of codes into the request here. But that's the way that we have to do this at this point. Okay, does that make sense? What we're doing there, and what that's all saying? Okay, great. So then the next step is the actual request response. So once you've got that content loaded and you've got a server that can answer your query there, then posting to that endpoint, right? Opioid CDS-10 patient view, you post the actual, this request, and you can see it's saying, I've got a hook instance. Here's the FHIR server if you need additional information. I'm launching you in the patient view. This is a kind of custom extension, you can ignore that. Context is user and patient ID and encounter ID. These are this is where I am in the workflow. Because what we're doing is simulating an EHR here with this request. So this is the request the actual EHR would put together if you were prescribing or if you were opening a patient and they had opioids prescribed, right? So then we plug in the prefetch, right? Basically the answers to those prefetch questions. And you can see all of that here, and let's go look at that. So basically you take this, that's your request, and you post that to that CDS service endpoint. And let's look at, so these are the prefetch answers, medication request, subject reference. Now you'll see some funky here. This is the authored on element with an extension to say, use this expression to provide the value for this. So remember that apply CQL? That's not part of base CDS hooks. But what we're doing here is, this is behavior that changes every day, right? I can't just set up a static set of resources and expect that that's going to run every day, because what I'm looking for is 80 of the last 90 days, right? That's a moving window. And so in order to get a test that runs against that, I actually have to express it in terms of today. So this is an expression in CQL that gives me today minus 90 days and says what I'm doing is producing a medication request that, for all intents and purposes, looks like it was authored 90 days ago, whatever today is, right? That way I don't have to keep changing my tests right? So it's basically using this machinery to get scripting for tests in place. And if you pass that apply CQL to the CQF ruler, then what it's going to do is look for all of these extensions, evaluate their result, and then assign them to the element on which they appear. So before it actually starts running all the logic to do the CDS hooks, or to do the CDS evaluation, it's going to resolve all of these dynamic expressions there. Does that make sense? Okay. So then, I think that's this one. let's see. Okay, so that one's telling me there's no decision support. So for recommendation 10, that's this one, recommendation 10's illicit drug content. And on that one, we send. And it says illicit drugs found in urine screening. So what we sent on this one, if we go back to that QuickStart, what we sent was a observation that of tetrahydrocannabinol presence in urine, right? So what the logic is doing there then is looking for any urine screening results that have a LOIN code in this value set for illicit drugs, right? So let's go dig into that actual CQL. So that is this one. Evidence of illicit drugs in the screening. So positive illicit drug. So that says most recent illicit drug urine screening in last 12 months. So let's look at that one. And that says the last of the illicit drug urine screenings in the last 12 months. And that says this one here. Observations where the code is in that illicit drug screening value set, and the date from observation is in the day of the look back year, where that look back year is defined by today. So we're looking within the last year. Have they had any screenings, observations with codes in that set? So look at this one, observation component code. What we're actually doing here is putting a search param in here. Component code is a search parameter for the observation resource. That's why it's telling me that it can't resolve that, because that's actually not an element of an observation component code, but it is something that I can search by. So the translator will tell you that that's a warning, but it won't prevent you from doing it. It will just assume that your data access layer knows what it's doing and can turn that into a component code search. The reason is that this observation might be at the code level, or it might be at the component level. And so you've got to cover both of those searches. So what we're doing then is unioning the result of those searches. You can argue whether that's the best approach, but given the way the observation is currently present, and the fact that whether it's part of a panel or a specific result depends on the way it was ordered, as well as the systems that are recording it. This is the best approach we could come up with at this point.
Combo code search parameter is supposed to be both.
There's a combo code that would do both?
Yes.
Awesome. I think we tried that. No, wait. We did. And the system that we're integrating with said, yeah, we can't really do that. And so we want you to split this out into unions of the independent search parameters, because the way their indexes worked, it was easier for them to do this than to do the combo code. Yes, we had originally used combo code, and they were like, what's combo code? So, okay.
I don't know if that was part of the keys to
That might be part of it. But they're actually ingesting this CQL and running it in their system. They're doing a translation to a Spark pipeline. And their index didn't support the combo code to actually do that. So we broke it apart for them. Another thing that they asked for, which I think is interesting. So basically, when you hit that service, it's calling the plan definition, which is saying, is there inclusion criteria and is there evidence of illicit drugs, which is calling out to the CQL and just running this inclusion criteria. And that's what the driver for the whole thing. Each of these has an inclusion criteria. Each of the libraries just has an inclusion criteria expression. And so in general, that's how the recommendations run. So this system, because it's running on a kind of an analytics warehouse type environment, the system that we're piloting this with, they actually want, instead of having to resolve the plan definition and do all the translation through that, they actually just wanted the CQL to return the entire recommendation. So in addition to being able to call it through a plan definition, we actually made a little modification so that it will actually just return a urine drug screening request. So in the case that the patient doesn't have a urine drug screening, we actually just build up the procedure request dynamically from the context. And so to ingest this now, all they have to do is run that expression. And it will, given the logic, either return nothing or return a procedure request if there's an issue there. Does that make sense? 5 minutes, all right. Okay, any other? So if you look across the recommendations as well, they each have this kind of pattern of indicator, summary, and detail. And those correspond to the fields in a CDS hooks response. So when you look at the response here, summary, indicator, source, those are being constructed out of the CQL there. And across the different libraries, they all use that same pattern. So it becomes easy to implement by convention. All right, so that's the QuickStart. So you should be able to stand up a server, load it with content, issue this patient view request, and get this CDS hooks response back.
Can you show the actual Git branch again? I can get a bunch of them.
Yes, there are a bunch of them. Yeah, we are trying to get that under control. That's the one that should work with this one. Yeah, this is all Apache 2. We are piloting now with that. That's one of the reasons for the branch is we're, getting that stable and applying all the changes there. So we're in the final stages of testing everything with 2 different. How am I not plugged in? Yes, yep, trying to get those all plugged in. My battery's dying. I don't know why this power strip isn't working. And so this is going to turn off in like any second. So I apologize for that. I don't know why. It says it's on, but I'm not getting any power out of it.
Just trying to get synced up. When you were showing a bunch of CQL files and add-them, how do I get there from the QuickStart document?
In the opioid GitHub repository, there's a pages CQL directory.
I'm on the QuickStart document. Is that repository on here somewhere?
In the content, in the QuickStart that has all of the okay. The QuickStart that lists the content, there's the CQL above that, but let me point you to the actual. There we go. Okay, power restored. Sorry, I don't have this link prepared. So, but this is the GitHub repository for the opioid CDSIG. This is the source for actually building all of that content. And so in the pages directory of that source, there's a CQL that has all the CQL. So if you open an Atom editor on that directory, then you'll be able to see all the CQL. And
Thanks.
yep. Okay. Any other questions? How many of you were able to run through the QuickStart? More or less? Okay. So that's a pretty low metric. We'll try to improve that next time.
Yeah.
So.
If I had not been like installing Maven and stuff, I probably would have been able to keep up with it.
Okay.
So, next time if you're giving this thing, say, have this stuff handy.
Right, have this ready to go. Okay.
Like Postman, I was installing that.
Okay. All right. Well, that's what we've got. There's feel free to submit issues against this if you come across any. Also, feel free to reach out on Zulip, ask any questions. Happy to help.